few friends and I went on an overnight hike in the mountains behind our small town a few years ago. Our campsite was quite far up, and it was starting to get dark. We found a spot nestled in a grove of trees, protected from the wind and the elements, so we decided to stop there for the night. The four of us built a small fire, had dinner, and spent a few hours just talking. Suddenly, one of my friends leaped forward and put out the fire with our emergency water, leaving us in complete darkness. The rest of us were understandably frustrated, as there seemed to be no reason for him to do that. But he quickly hushed us, and we realized he was absolutely terrified. He was so scared that he couldn't speak or move for a moment. Eventually, we got a few words out of him, and he urged us to look up at the ridge where we had originally planned to camp. It was quite far away, so it was difficult to see at first, but what we saw is something that will stay with me forever. There was a fire. It's a large one like a bonfire. Surrounding the fire were several figures moving slowly in a circle. They appeared humanoid, but something about them was off. Their limbs seemed longer and thinner than normal, though it was hard to pinpoint exactly what was wrong. They continued to move around the fire in a slow, repetitive motion. One of my friends claimed he could hear them singing, though I don't recall hearing anything myself. What stood out most was one figure standing slightly apart from the group, leaning against a tree branch with an arm raised above its head. The sight was deeply unsettling, but we managed to brush it off in sleep, convincing ourselves it was likely a group of scouts camping nearby. The next morning, we completed our hike to the peak, and on our way down, we passed the area where we had seen the figures. We decided to check it out. The campsite was completely deserted, though it was obvious there had been a fire, and footprints were scattered everywhere. Inside the fire pit, we found a small pile of charred animal bones, probably from a chipmunk, and a few burned rodent skulls. It was unnerving, to say the least. We then checked the spot where the one figure had been standing. There were traces of blood. It's not a lot, but enough to be concerning. Then we noticed the tree branch it had been leaning on. It was well above any of our heads, and I'm over 6 feet tall. For someone to lean on that branch the way the figure had, they would have needed to be at least 7 feet tall. Needless to say, we got off the mountain as quickly as possible, and I haven't been back since. We reported what we saw to the local fish and wildlife rangers, but they dismissed it, saying it was probably just kids playing a prank. Maybe it was, and maybe our imaginations got the better of us. But all four of us swear we saw the same thing, and it didn't look like a group of kids messing around in the dark. I'm not one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but those mountains still give me chills, and I don't plan on returning anytime soon. My boyfriend, Jason, and I decided to take a month-long camping trip, exploring multiple states. Everything had been going smoothly until October 9th. On that day, we chose to forego a campground reservation and spontaneously set up our tent near Albion Basin, close to the secret lake trailhead in Alta, Utah. We parked our car around 3 p.m. at the Albion Basin campground, which was closed for the season. Tensions were high because it was our first attempt at dispersed camping, and we didn't have proper backpacking gear. We soon realized that the spot where we planned to pitch our tent was about 2 miles uphill. At this point, both of us began to feel regret, especially since we had skipped a planned campsite in Nephi, Utah, on a whim. After some grumbling, we ate a large lunch to avoid having to pack too much food and gathered our gear, knowing the temperature would drop to 25 degrees overnight. We headed up the trail, occasionally passing families or couples descending the mountain. As we continued, an odd feeling crept over us, making us question why we were even doing this. It seemed like we should have just stayed in a hotel rather than pretending to be seasoned backpackers for the night. Yet stubbornness pushed us to keep going. Eventually, we reached Secret Lake. It was empty, far from the picturesque scene we had envisioned, and had an eerie atmosphere. Disappointed, we continued to hike further up the mountain, searching for seclusion and a flat spot to set up camp. We found a decent area and noticed a small cave nearby. I pointed it out to Jason, unsure if it was a bad idea to camp so close to it. After checking it out, he determined it was just a small animal's crawl space. Nothing to worry about. As night approached, we set up camp, played some cards, bundled up, and decided to go to bed early, around 8:30 p.m., planning to leave by 5 a.m. After what felt like only 30 minutes, I woke up abruptly at 11:24 p.m. I had an overwhelming feeling, one I'd never experienced before, that something was off. I was wide awake, scared, and felt there was no way I'd fall back asleep, which was unusual for me. Jason was still asleep, so I didn't wake him, but I lay there, listening intently to the silence around us. Around midnight, Jason began to stir, and I was relieved that I wasn't alone anymore. When I told him I couldn't sleep, he suggested I just rest my eyes since we'd be leaving early. I tried to calm myself, not wanting to seem overly anxious, but soon Jason found himself unable to sleep as well. We lay there for a while before I finally admitted that I was scared. He reassured me that we were safe and reminded me that we had a small axe and a pellet gun for protection. We both agreed to tough it out for the rest of the night. A few minutes later, just as we were still wide awake, Jason suddenly lifted his head, startling me. When I asked him what was wrong, he told me to listen. That's when we both clearly heard the sound of gravel crunching under footsteps. It was as if someone had walked right up to our tent, paused, and then moved to my side. I felt my blood run cold. This all happened in just a few seconds, but my mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. For a moment, I convinced myself it might be a ranger coming to check on us, so I called out, "Hello," but no one responded. Jason quickly grabbed the gun and rushed out of the tent, ready to confront whoever or whatever it was. I followed him out, but there was no one there. We had heard footsteps so clearly, yet no one was in sight, and we never heard anyone walk away. Barely exchanging words, we quickly packed up our things, constantly looking over our shoulders, feeling as though we were being watched. We descended the mountain as fast as we could, relying on the moonlight to guide us, too scared to even turn on our flashlights. Those 20 to 30 minutes were some of the most terrifying moments of my life. I kept expecting to see someone following us whenever I glanced back. When we finally reached the car, we locked the doors and immediately started driving down the mountain. Neither of us spoke much, still shaken by what had just happened. We drove until we reached town around 3:30 a.m. and parked in a well-lit grocery store parking lot, where we finally managed to get some sleep. Since that night, we've talked about it numerous times, and both of us remain unsettled by the memory of those footsteps. My brother, 2 years older than me, and I have probably spent over 10,000 hours together in the woods. Whether it was building forts, creating BMX tracks, role-playing, or hunting, we were always outdoors. Since 2016, we've traveled across the US, exploring caves, canyons, cliff diving, mountain biking, and hunting everything from white-tailed deer to wild boar whenever we had time off. I mention this because I've never been afraid of anything when he's with me. But this time, something was different, and we both felt it. We've had plenty of adventures and stories to tell, but this one left a lasting impression on my memory. We were both in our mid-20s, and it was 2019. This was probably my 5th time hunting this particular area, but the first time I had brought my brother along. The area was a large forested expanse of public land, with a few county roads that were basically long 2-tracks stretching for miles. We made the trip in my truck, bringing along 3 tents, one for each of us and a third for changing and storing gear. After driving for quite a few miles into the trails, we set up camp a couple of miles from the truck, far from any main roads. The closest one was probably 8 to 10 miles away, so we were truly in the middle of nowhere. We arrived late at night, set up camp quickly, and fell asleep after the long trip. The next day, we spent scouting and tracking, then returned to camp in the evening. After cooking dinner, we had a few beers and chatted. It was still early, but we were exhausted from the day and decided to call it a night. Up until that point, everything had been perfectly normal. Sometime before dawn, I woke up abruptly to something hitting my tent, followed by my brother's voice calling my name. I could tell something was wrong. I called back, and he quickly unzipped my tent and slipped inside. The look on his face told me that something had deeply unsettled him. When I asked what was wrong, he grabbed my shoulder and told me to be quiet. It was still dark, probably around 4:30 or 5 a.m. We sat in silence, and what we heard next still baffles me. The sound was something I can only describe as resembling whale sounds. It was a series of extremely loud noises with varying tones that reverberated through our bodies. The sounds would come and go, but there were only a few seconds of silence between them. The tones ranged from high-pitched squeals to low, rumbling noises that shook the ground. I was so stunned that I didn't even think to grab my phone to record what we were hearing. It didn't feel real at the time, and I was completely captivated by the experience. The sounds continued until daylight started to break. I believe it lasted about an hour, but I can't be sure. Neither of us spoke during that time. It felt like the air around me was charged with a strange energy, almost as if my entire body was buzzing with static. Not long after the sound stopped, it began to rain, and we were caught in one of the wildest thunderstorms I've ever experienced while camping. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies for the entire trip, so the sudden storm was unexpected. The stakes for the tent where we stored our gear were ripped out of the ground, and even our tents had several stakes pulled loose. These stakes had been driven in deep with an axe, so it would have taken an incredible force to uproot them. My brother now dismisses the whole event, claiming it was just machinery being dragged somewhere, but at the time we both felt the same overwhelming sense of fear and unease. It just doesn't seem right, considering it was still the middle of the night, and we were so far removed from any communities or industrial areas that could have caused such an occurrence. In May 2009, I had just ended a nearly 3-year relationship with my girlfriend. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto, and after the breakup, we were still stuck living together because we didn't know many people in the city yet. As you can imagine, it was a pretty stressful and upsetting situation. So when a friend I was attending school with at the time suggested a weekend camping and fishing trip, I jumped at the opportunity. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's a beautiful place with lots of lush forests, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's near some wetlands, and the fishing there is supposed to be really good. We ended up setting up camp in what was probably a farmer's field, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, chatting, and enjoying some quality craft beers. As the night wore on, we made a small fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. Overall, it was a really good time. We turned in just after midnight, sharing a tent. My friend fell asleep before I did, and I stayed up playing on my phone until about 1:30. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was waking up to a high-pitched yipping sound. I was groggy at first, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was constant and sounded like some strange coyote. I lay there for a bit, listening, before going back to playing on my phone. The noise was getting annoying, and it seemed like it was coming closer. Eventually, it felt like whatever was making the sound was no more than 10 feet from the tent. I started to feel uneasy. I'd seen coyotes in Calgary before and always thought of them as pretty harmless since they never seemed bigger than a small dog. But I couldn't help but worry. What if this one was rabid? Or what if it was drawn to the smell of our food? I tend to be anxious, so my mind started racing with those kinds of thoughts. I nudged my friend to see if he was awake. He was, as the noise had woken him up too. We quietly talked about what to do since we hadn't brought anything to scare off animals, not even a BB gun. My friend eventually decided he'd shine a flashlight outside and make some noise, hoping to scare it away. He unzipped the tent and pointed the flashlight into the darkness. What happened next is something I'll never forget. His legs suddenly went weak, and he stumbled back into the tent with a shocked look on his face. He told me, looking completely terrified, that it wasn't a coyote, it was a person, some strange person. Normally, I would have thought he was joking, especially since I scare easily and hate horror movies, but I could tell from his expression that this wasn't a joke. I've never seen someone look that scared before, and I hope I never see it again. The strange yipping noises continued, and in hindsight, they really didn't sound like a coyote, but I guess our groggy minds were trying to make sense of it. He urged me to take a look out the tent flap to make sure he wasn't imagining things. At this point, my anxiety was in overdrive, and my heart was racing, but I had to see for myself. I slowly peeked outside, waiting for my eyes to adjust, and then I saw him. He was standing only a few feet away from the tent, swaying slightly, and wearing a baseball cap. What made it truly disturbing, though, was that he was dressed in women's lingerie. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong with this guy, as if the yipping noises outside a stranger's tent in the middle of the night hadn't already given it away. After I pulled my head back into the tent, my friend and I quickly debated what to do. We decided to shout at him to leave. My friend yelled, demanding that the person go away and that we were trying to sleep. The noises stopped, and there was an eerie silence before we heard footsteps running towards the tent. They stopped right outside, but we didn't hesitate. We started shouting again, warning him that we had cell phones and would call the police if he didn't leave. After that, we heard him walk away, heading towards the road. We stayed awake, too frightened to sleep, until the first light of dawn. As soon as it was bright enough, we packed up and got out of there as fast as we could. On the way home, we talked about what had happened, both of us feeling a little embarrassed about how scared we had gotten. It certainly wasn't our most courageous moment. I think because we were both ashamed of how much we had let a random stranger scare us, we haven't really talked about it since. To this day, I still wonder what that guy was doing out there and what might have been wrong with him. Sometimes, I think about how things could have turned out differently if we had been a couple of women. I'm not saying he was a dangerous person, but it did seem like he was testing who was in the tent. I guess I'll never know, and for that, I'm kind of glad. I went camping in Big Sur, California with one of my best friends. It was the off-season and a quiet Sunday night, so the place was nearly deserted. We chose a campsite about a half-mile walk from the ocean, situated in a wide, open field encircled by a vibrant forest. In the distance, limestone mountains rose, and the sound of crashing ocean waves echoed through the air. The setting felt almost surreal. We spent the night around a campfire, sharing stories and enjoying our food. Both of us are seasoned backpackers, so we made sure to follow strict practices, keeping food away from our site and storing almost everything, aside from essentials, in the bear bag or box. My dog was with me too. She's an ADA service animal, so she was allowed at the site. I had her secured to one of the few trees in the field with a long metal leash and harness. The full moon cast a beautiful blue glow over the field, making the scene look both pristine and awe-inspiring. At around 1 a.m., something startled my dog. She's usually calm and accustomed to the wilderness, but suddenly, she was in a full panic, pulling hard on the leash as if trying to escape. Before I could react, she broke free from her harness and darted off into the forest. I immediately panicked. Without thinking, I dropped everything and ran after her, not considering the danger of sprinting into the woods in the middle of the night. My only thought was to find her, even if it meant risking my own safety. Thankfully, I did. I found her in a small clearing, curled up and trembling, looking both frightened and guilty. I was incredibly relieved she had run in a straight line. Otherwise, I would have been completely lost. As I carried her back, my heart was racing, imagining the horror of losing her in the wilderness. She was still terrified, her little heart pounding in my arms. The mood had shifted completely. Back at the tent, my dog refused to lie down. Her ears perked up, eyes fixed on the tent wall, as though she was tracking something unseen outside. I was still shaken from the chase, but tried to calm myself, taking deep breaths and reminding myself we were prepared for anything. I reasoned that my dog was likely spooked by a raccoon or maybe just exhausted and acting out. But then, I heard a sound that sent a chill through me. It was cackling, a high-pitched laugh, unnerving and full of a strange, unsettling joy, coming from somewhere outside the tent. My breathing stopped, and my body tensed up, fear taking hold. More laughter followed, like a group of people, perhaps a few yards away, engaged in something sinister. The sound grew louder, filling the night air. It was wrong, unnatural. I was too paralyzed to even look at my friend. As if the laughter wasn't terrifying enough, it was soon accompanied by what sounded like blood-curdling screams, full of panic and agony. Could have been wild animals, wolves, or coyotes taking down prey. But the sounds were so disturbingly human: laughter, sobbing, and those awful screams. My friend eventually broke the silence, muttering something, bewildered by the situation. In the intensity of it all, I found myself laughing nervously, unsure how else to react to the sheer absurdity of it. I suggested we make a run for the car, but it was a mile away. We decided to stay put, listening to the eerie sounds until they gradually faded. Even when the noises stopped, I didn't bother trying to sleep. The night had become too strange, too unnerving to even consider resting.